Okay, welcome back to the first in-person legal holiday class since before COVID. I want to thank Rabbi Walters very much for taking from his time to come and learn with us. And as Hillel said before he created the calendar, without any further ado, Rabbi Walters.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to start off with mentioning a letter of the Rebbe that a couple of years ago was around Rosh Hashanah time, and I was thinking, it's Rosh Hashanah, we're supposed to be Kabbalas Malchus, accepting God as our King, and it's kind of bothering me because I know, like, I'm not going to do everything I'm supposed to do, and things that I ran into a great letter of the Rebbe that answered it for me, and he said, imagine if you go and you see somebody coming out of the Rebbe says, a doctor, a professor. The Rebbe would call, I guess, Chashiv doctor, important doctor, is coming out in crutches. So the onlooker could say, look at this guy went to the doctor, he paid him good money, and he comes out and he can't take one step without crutches. What good is it? So he said, it's not fair to look at it that way, because first of all, you don't know the way the guy was before he went in. Maybe before he went in, he was paralyzed. He couldn't move at all. Now he can walk with crutches. And also, the fact that he's on crutches doesn't mean that he's not listening, follow the doctor's instructions. And, it just takes time. And it could be that as time progresses, he'll actually, heal completely and he won't even need the crutches. So it's in a similar way, when we look at ourselves and other people, we shouldn't just look at a person the way they are and say, look, they have these problems, so it shows that there's something wrong with them. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not listening to the Torah or something. It's not necessarily true, because every single person is born with certain flaws. No one's born perfect. And this is the whole thing of life, is that we have to work on ourselves. And so it starts with the chinuch, the education we get from our parents, from our teachers. But then once we become an adult, we have the obligation of educating ourselves. And it's a lifelong process. And just because you're seeing somebody in the middle of the process doesn't mean that they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And that's the process. So I think that is a very good, kind of, I don't know if it's everything that it says about it, but it's definitely a very good point to keep in mind with all these things, having that perspective that, life is all about growth, and it's all about that every single one of us have to grow. Even Moshe, says, learn from the simple people, so that he has to toil in learning Torah. So we all have this idea of constantly learning and constantly growing, no matter who we are, where we are. And that's the essence of what life is about. So, we'll take a look first at the source for this mitzvah of rebuking our fellow. So it comes from Vayikra, Leviticus 19, verses 18 and 19. And these are some pretty famous things we have here. It says, first of all, do not hate your fellow in your heart. You should surely rebuke. Whenever you use a double expression, it implies that you should do it even again and again. And you should not bear sin because of him. That's a little bit ambiguous what that means in this context. That's the first verse. And the second verse continues the theme. You shouldn't take revenge. You shouldn't bear a grudge against any of your fellow people. You should love your fellows yourself. Right? So this is pretty clearly sandwiched. It starts off, don't hate your fellow. It gives us a list that you should rebuke somebody. You shouldn't bear sin. You shouldn't bear a grudge. And then you should love Hashem. You should love your fellow. So this is, where this mitzvah comes in. So clearly in the context, you see that this idea of rebuke is meant to be, first of all, not with any hatred, and second of all, it's actually leading up to loving our fellow. It's part of to love our fellow as ourselves. And but what does this mean? That we shouldn't bear sin because of him. So there's different explanations that are given. We'll just take a look. Rashi, he says that it means that when you rebuke the person, you have to be careful not to embarrass them, because if you'll do it publicly, if you do it in a way that's going to cause them to be embarrassed, then you're going to be at fault. So even though you have an obligation to rebuke them, you have to do it in a way that will not cause you to sin. Other people say, like the Ramban, that he actually brings two things. One is that if if you don't rebuke him, then you're held responsible. That's what some people also explain it. So you're not bearing sin because you need to say something, see something, say something. But he also has a very interesting explanation that's a little bit different, but I think still very important and worth noting, that the way he explains this whole idea is that, like you see in the context, is telling us that we shouldn't hate other people. We have to cultivate love for other people. So the Torah is telling you how to do that. And it's saying the way that you do that is that if somebody does something against you that bother you, you should say something to them. You should say, why do you do that to me? To talk it out. Because otherwise, otherwise you're going to attribute sin to them. You're going to assume that they did something wrong, that they had bad intentions, right? And you're going to just making that assumption, which is not correct. And then you're going to come to bear a grudge and all these kind of things. And so therefore, he says, if you have a problem with somebody, just between you and somebody else, you should talk it out. So that's the way the Ramban explains this, which is, very important, but not totally related to rebuke. And so there's, in Halacha and Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, there's the laws of rebuking somebody. So you can look at that. We're not going to get to all those halachas here. But Chasidus has a few points that I think are very fundamental to the whole perspective and help make sure that it's done the right way. So the first point that Chasidus points out that you see clearly also from the context of the pasuk is that it has to be obviously done not out of any hatred, but out of love. And like we see this in Hayom Yom. We just had this recently, that it says the mitzvah, the command that you should rebuke, is preceded by the words, you should not hate your brother, right? You shouldn't, like we saw. And so that's a prerequisite. In order to give somebody a rebuke, it has to be that you can't have any bad feelings against the person. And furthermore, this is something that's emphasized a lot in the Chasidus, that it says that you shouldn't, here they translate this as you shouldn't ascribe sin to him, that you shouldn't, in other words, the way it's explaining it, at least the way they translate it here, is that if you rebuked a person and they didn't listen, you shouldn't feel that it's their fault, because it's clearly your fault. If you did it correctly, then they would have listened. That's the way I would have translated this pasuk, that you shouldn't, view the person in a negative light, because if by doing that, then if you would view them in a positive way, then they would have they would have listened, and then, like he says, the words that came from the heart, right? If some words that come from the heart will be received by the heart, the person really meant it in a sincere, positive, loving way, and the person definitely would have listened. And so I'm not sure which translation of this pasuk is more fitting with the way that Hayom Yom is explaining it, but either way, the idea is that if we have that proper attitude when we're going into approaching another person, then they're going to listen. If not, it shows that we're not coming with that proper perspective. And there's another Hayom Yom that talks about this idea. This is from Tishrei, 24th of Tishrei. He says the whole idea of having a farbrengen, of having gathering together, is something that's fundamental to Avos Yisrael, the mitzvah of Avos Yisrael. And he says, in general, the whole idea of a farbrengen is the person that's speaking is supposed to be, giving this kind of public rebuke, demanding that we improve ourselves, we spend more time learning, spend more time davening. If you look at the earlier, generations, the farbrengens of the previous Rebbes were much smaller and more intimate, like these. And the Rebbe, would be sitting at a table with not necessarily that many Hasidim. And a lot of times he would be speaking to somebody about saying, you have to spend some time to learn every day. The person would be saying, but I'm too busy, I don't have time. And tell him, well, you have to make time. And in fact, somebody showed me a very interesting farbrengen of the Rebbe Rashab, where he was talking to a businessman, and he was telling him, like, what should I do? As soon as I wake up, they bring me telegrams for my business and things like that. Kind of like today, where right away your phone and you have emails, you have all this kind of stuff. It's not like a new thing. And he said, just like when you were sleeping, they had mercy on you. They didn't wake you up special to read the telegram. So you have to have mercy on yourself, on your own soul, and wait until you dive in and do a couple things, and then read. But anyway, so this is the idea of farbrengen is meant to be this type of rebuke, like he says, to make time to study Chasidus and these kind of things. But he brings here that the proper way to give rebuke is something that's described in this mimer. The Frierdiker Rebbe wrote this mimer. He published it to be learned on Yebez Gimel Tammuz in Ruach HaMaishal. And so he says every chassid should learn it very well and take it to heart. So you can all put in your petitions to have a shir in Ruach HaMaishal. It's a very nice mimer. Okay, sure. But he says once again that this type of rebuke that happens from Reagan has to be in a way that's not to cause any embarrassment, right? And this was always, he says, the way that it was by Chassidim, that it was always with deep love and affection. And that's the way it's supposed to be. So this is just laying out, you see, from very simply from my Yemen, that we're all familiar with the basic idea of what Chasidus wants from us. And I was once started translating this mimer, but I didn't quite finish, but I'll give you a little taste of the beginning of it. So it's based on this pasuk that, which is a lot of sukkim in Tanakh are a little bit ambiguous in what they mean. They be translated in very different ways, and different Mepharshim translate them very differently. Like the Shabbos was looking at the Living Torah Chumash, a lot of times he'll translate something one way, to the footnotes will bring from a different Mepharshim, completely different translation, the entire pasuk. And so here, right, it says, Ruach HaMaisho Tala Alecha. So I translated according to one. You have to pick one translation, right? If the anger of a lord, a ruler, flares up against you, right? The Kaimcha al Tanakh, don't give up your post. Don't get all, leave and quit or whatever. Because when his anger will calm down, so then he'll forgive even for big things. That's one translation. But so the Rebbe in this Meyer brings two very different translations. The Targum says he translates it as referring to Yetzer Hara. I can send you the whole file too if you want. That is referring to the Yetzer Hara. That if a person's evil inclination, which is the spirit, the ruach that rules over a person, flares up over, you shouldn't say, oh, I sinned, I did this and that, and therefore, I'm not cut out for Torah or this and that. And he says, no, keep doing the good things that you're doing, because eventually that will heal your Yetzer Hara and will bring you back to good. So you shouldn't get discouraged because you messed up this and that. You should stick with it, and eventually the Torah will bring healing, and Hashem will forgive you even for serious things. So that's one translation. But then he brings another translation from Medrash Rabbah. That he says, what does it mean in Ruach HaMaishal? He says that if a person is appointed to a position of leadership, right? So in Ruach HaMaishal, Talach means if you become a leader, that you shouldn't lose your original place, shouldn't lose your sense of humility of where you originally sensed. I used to just be a little nothing. You should still feel, that I'm still the same old Joe. And he says, because if a person, becomes arrogant and loses that sense of humility, so then they bring sins to their generation. We learned this from Zechariah, that it says that Zechariah, when he became, the Spirit of God came onto him, and it says he stood above the people. He looked at them like in a condescending way, as if he was above them, placed above them. And so the Medrash says, what does he mean he stood above the people? Did he walk on their heads, right? They like to be very ironic in the way they speak. So it says, rather, he saw himself superior to them because he was the son-in-law of the king. He was a Kohen Gadol, means he was the descendant from the Kohen Gadol. He himself wasn't a Kohen Gadol. He was a Navi, and he was a judge and everything like that, a prophet, a judge. And so he spoke when he rebuked the people, he rebuked them with this sense of superiority. And he said, why do you transgress the commandments of Hashem when you cannot succeed? And so actually they stoned him to death. That he got the crowd so angry that they stoned him, and it's a whole separate story about how his blood was boiling there for many years. It was a whole unfortunate thing in many ways. But in contrast to that, it says that Yahaziel, who is the son of Zechariah, didn't act that way, and that says that even though he became a prophet, that he was in the midst of the community. He was with the people. That he considered himself a regular person like everybody else. He didn't consider himself better than others. And so this is the main idea of this mimer. And we're not going to, it's long. We're not going to go to the whole thing. But that it's essential that a person never look at themselves as being like superior to somebody else. And in order to give to the group successfully, you can't feel that they have a problem. This person has a problem that I don't have. You always have to find that same problem in yourself in some way, and feel that in some way I'm also struggling with this. I struggled with it in the past, I struggle with it now. I think the simplest thing in the general sense, like there's a Kunteris, that little booklet that the previous Rebbe wrote. The previous Rebbe was appointed to head the yeshiva Tomchei Tmim. Actually, it was his wedding present. He wanted to have a yeshiva that would study Chasidus, and he asked his father to start one, the Rebbe Rashab, and he didn't want to at first, but then he agreed for his wedding present. The Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, was made the head of the yeshiva at a young age, and so he wrote a booklet for the teachers about education. But it's general, it's not just for children, it's for children and adults and everything. And the first point that he makes there is this idea about how life is about growth. And so a person has to have this attitude that they see that I'm constantly growing and I'm constantly improving and work and being able to be comfortable admitting that I also have flaws and I also have problems and I'm working on them, and that's life. And so then you can relate to somebody else because you can see, okay, so you're working on your things, I'm working on my things. But even more specifically, you see that Chasidus says you should really actually find that specific problem in yourself as well. But this is the first thing, is that it has to be with a sense of really relating to the other person, not with any sort of sense of superiority. And he brings different examples of how we see that Moshe and Aaron and Yeshua were not held responsible for Cain and Abel because of their humility, as well as if somebody, considers themselves superior, and then they're actually responsible for the sins of the other people. So this is it's a very interesting thing. It doesn't bring it here, but it's elsewhere it says it brings. The Moshe Rabbeinu, it says, when it says he was more humble than any man upon the earth, it says he didn't consider himself better even than a Goya, even a Zara, even than a Gentile idolater. Because he said, maybe if that person, would have my talents, my abilities, maybe he would do better than me, or maybe for where he is and the opportunities and situation he's in, maybe he's doing better than where I am. Like we mentioned before, that it says that in Matan Torah, Moshe learned from the simple people, the fact they had to work so hard for the Torah, which for him was always easy, taught him that, I have to also learn from that and put in that kind of effort in studying Torah. So, there's this idea of having that extreme humility, and learning from every person is the first point that you see in Chasidus that has to come with that sense of connecting. And I think, the biggest idea of that, just on a very practical level, is that it has, it should be coming like from the point of view of like a coach, that like you're trying to help the person improve their game, and you're on their side, and it's like, yeah, I've been through that. These are the strategies I've learned. This is something, if you have advice to help a person in a certain area, part of loving somebody is to give them that advice, but it has to be coming from that sense that you're there to guide them. And actually, like we mentioned before about being Zachariah, being descended from the Kohen Gadol, it's brought, the Tzemach Tzedek talks about in the idea of the tzitz, the Kohen Gadol would wear this gold, head plate. So what's the idea of that? It says that the forehead represents a commitment to something, a very strong commitment to something. And so that, in that context of the Kohen, that represents the commitment to Torah mitzvahs, so, being very religious. And the problem is, when a person, though, is very committed to Torah mitzvahs, it can lead to being judgmental, because then you see people, doing things wrong, especially the Beis Mikdash, right? The level of holy and purity that's required. And so the tzitz is, like, in a simple sense, our sages tell us it's there to forgive for people that inadvertently came into the temple when they were impure or things like that. But Chasidus and Kabbalah say that it represents this idea of remembering, like, the ultimate purpose of the Torah mitzvahs that were given to benefit the people, the Jewish people. So the people really come first. And so therefore, that tempers that sense of judgment with a sense of mercy and love for our fellow. And this is like we say in Pirkei Avos, we always end up every chapter that Rabbi that because God wanted to bring merit to us, that's why he gave us so much Torah mitzvahs. So the point isn't that we could find, a list of things we did wrong. The point is to give us so many opportunities to grow. And, so remember that the purpose of all the Torah mitzvahs is to help people. Then that perspective. Anyway, the second thing, though, so the first thing is just that general idea that it has to be with a sense of love and humility and not looking down on another person. But more specifically, this is the idea we have to find the same flaw in ourselves. And so there's a great sikha about this on Parshas Noach in Chasidus volume 10. And so there the Rebbe discusses the whole story there about how when Noach got drunk and his sons, found him and mocked him, and the other brothers, they covered him without even looking. And so the Rebbe uses that to discuss this idea of how the proper way to look at, to perceive somebody else's flaws. And he brings this teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, that the Baal Shem Tov says whenever we see a flaw in somebody else, it's like a mirror, and it really is reflecting on us. So if we see that somebody else has a problem, we must also have in some way that problem in ourselves. And so we should learn from that. We should, that if God, that God showed us this flaw, that means that we have to see how we can find ourselves and work on it. So Rabbi asked a simple question. So this idea of the Baal Shem Tov is based on the idea that everything we see and hear is Hashgacha Pratis. God is arranging it for some purpose for us. So who says that the reason he's showing it to me is because I have the problem? Maybe he's showing it to me because I have to help the other person fix it, right? And so, the Rebbe has a couple ideas about it, but the main idea is that there's two parts of seeing the problem in somebody else. One is that you see that there's, like, you could, like a doctor, you go to a doctor and you say, I have this and that, and the doctor's like, okay, what do we need to do to fix it, right? So the idea of seeing something in just that kind of detached way, where it's like, if there's a problem and this is what we need to fix it, and if I have an opportunity to help, I'm here to help. So that when you see that shows that you have an obligation and the opportunity to try to help the person. But then there's the idea of seeing it as being something bad, as being evil, and that having that like the way that Cham, when he saw his father, he looked at it as being something bad, and he was talking about it, he was laughing about it. The brothers looked at it and said, okay, it happens, what do we need to do about it? And they covered him. So he said, this is that when a person sees something just as, okay, what do I need to do to take care of it? That shows that it doesn't bother a person in a that kind of like emotional way. That shows that I have the right state to be able to do something about it. But when we see something, a flaw in somebody else, and it really agitates us, and we really view it as being evil, and how could they do that, and we can't understand it, we can't relate to it, that really shows that we haven't yet come to terms with that thing in ourselves. We're still struggling in some way with that, and maybe it's kind of repressed. It's kind of in the back of our psyche, we're not relating to that part of ourselves, and we just kind of ignore it, and so we haven't learned to deal with it. If it's something we would have struggled with and overcome, and we'd have really be beyond that, then we would be able to relate to the other person and say, yeah, I've been there, I've done that, I know what it's about, and we'd be able to relate to them in a way that could be constructive. So that's a very important thing, and it's two things. One is there's always those two aspects, but it's also like a kind of a lesson for us that we have to look at ourselves and how am I reacting to it? If I'm reacting it in a way that I could be kind of dispassionate and I can be constructive to the other person, so then go ahead. Then you have an obligation, like it says, you should surely rebuke. Even 100 times, if you have a chance to help somebody and teach them and coach them, you got to keep doing it. But on the other hand, if it's with that kind of judgmentalism and that kind of a sense of looking down on the person or judging the person, or and that kind of emotionalism, that shows that really you still have to work on it yourself first before you'll be able to. First of all, practically you still have to, and second of all, if you try to rebuke the person, it's going to fall on deaf ears. It's not going to work. So this is something we learned from that with Naya. And there's actually a wonderful story about this. There's two stories that are brought. The Rebbe, when the previous Rebbe published this mimer, the Rebbe also had, I think, not possible, it's printed before the mimer. It might have been from a different time. That the Rebbe wrote to the Frierdiker Rebbe asking, because there it just mentions that there's a story related to this idea that you have to find the flaw in yourself that it mentions in the mimer. And the Rebbe asked the Frierdiker Rebbe about what was the story. He didn't know the story. And it's printed now in the beginning of the mimer, these two, one story about the Mittler, one about the Tzimmer Tzedek. And but basically somebody came to the Mittler Rebbe asking for a tikkun to be, repair or something, a sin they did. And sometimes it says what it was and it doesn't say what it was because it was a pretty bad thing. And so after this person came to the Mittler Rebbe, all of a sudden the Mittler Rebbe locked up in his room. He stopped accepting anybody in for Chasidus for a few days, and everybody saw that it was a serious thing. He started saying Tillim and things, and then it was only after a few days of him fasting and saying Tillim that he called a person back in and went back to normal. And what happened was that it says that this person came to him and it was something very serious, and he couldn't find it in himself. He couldn't find the problem in himself. And the way it explains it there is a very interesting thing, that if a person, even a tzaddik, if they can't find that same flaw in themselves, then that shows that it's what's called like the hel marah. It's that evil is hidden within them very deeply. And because we have, like it explains, we have 600, the word keser, right? Keser is the numerical value of 620, and that represents our will, our desire. And that corresponds to 613 mitzvahs plus the 7 rabbinic mitzvahs. And the idea is that, every single person has all 620 of these different desires. Each of those desires, we have to be aware of them, and we have to be channeling them into a wholly positive thing. If we're not aware of a desire and actively channeling it, then that means that in some way it's being diverted to something negative. And so the very fact that he wasn't aware of that within himself and was to find it, know that, oh yes, this is how I'm addressing it, showed that on his level, in some very small way, that was not being addressed and it wasn't being taken care of. And it wasn't, so he did whatever, he fasted until his father, the Alter appeared to him and told him that he once sighed about money. And that was like the corresponding sin for this person, that he was able to fix it, and then he was able to call the person in and address it. So so this is obviously we're not a rebbe, we're not a tzaddik, and we may not have fixed all of our 620 things, and that's why there's certain people we relate to and certain people we can't stand. It's part of that, like it talks about in the mitzvah of Ahavas Yisrael, that really all the Jewish people were all interconnected, and if we reject somebody else, it really shows that we're rejecting a part of ourselves. And the ability to connect to somebody else and understand and relate to them is really also part of uncovering and developing that part of ourselves. So the two are a little bit interrelated, but that's a little bit of a tangential idea that's connected here. But it's
what you just said now is incredibly meaningful. That's like worth just for that. That was amazing. What you just said. What did you just say? I mean, we'll take it to the extreme. Why does the Rebbe have so much Ahavas Yisrael? Because he's so perfected himself, so therefore he accepts everything. Why do I not have Ahavas Yisrael? Because since I am whatever my problem is, when I see the guy with that problem, I don't like him. But that's amazing. That's the greatest thing I've heard in a long time. That's unbelievable what you just said. Can you say that again? So that's amazing what you just said. It's so clarifying. We point to the Rebbe. How do you have Ahavas? We think, how do you have Ahavas Yisrael? I learned to tolerate this guy. No, if I will, I'll call it the word perfect myself, so I'll have Ahavas Yisrael. Because the impediment to Ahavas Yisrael is my own flaws. That's amazing. You're good at this. Well, that's unbelievable what you just said. I mean, I don't believe it. The word is
and I experienced this a little bit when I was a kid. I was like in 8th grade. I had a teacher I didn't get along with. And so I kept getting in trouble in that class and whatever. And my father took me for a ride, and he said, "Listen, if you want, I can go talk to the teacher and talk to the school and things like that. But the truth is, in life, there's always going to be people that you're not going to get along with. It might be a roommate, it might be a coworker, it might be this, and you can't change other people. You have to learn to change yourself. You can learn to get along with somebody you don't like." And that was like eye-opening for me. Like I could actively try to get along, to like somebody or get to relate to them and things like that. But yeah, I mean, so there's always whatever you see that's one of the ideas the Baal Shem Tov is saying. When you see somebody that you can't stand or this and that, it shows that it's an opportunity to look at yourself and see. Well, it goes both ways. One of the points that it makes in that Sifa in Parshas Naya is that even though you have an obligation, an opportunity to help other people, but you can't say that a situation is happening only for somebody else. It must also be because, from like my perspective or whatever, there's this idea that I have intrinsic value. The world was created just for me. There must be always something also for me in that. And so that's why there's this idea that I can learn something and grow from that. And like, see, even the Rebbe, whenever somebody's coming to them, he's finding a way. In fact, it says that the Rebbeim would not just do this, like, and that's the case where they were stuck, but anytime a person came to them, they would always find a way that they are going to commit to grow and improve that area in themselves first before giving advice to the other person in that area. So, that was a constant thing. And I think it's something also, before you're going over to somebody else to tell them off or, to try to encourage them to improve in something else, think about what could I do to improve in that thing too, and to take it to another level on myself? That's realizing, yeah, I also need to be growing there. So that's, I think, the second major point you see in Chasidus. It's very enlightening about it. And then there's a third point that the Rebbe makes, and especially very strongly the Sicha in Parshas Emor in volume 27. I'll look at the Sichas that, so when giving rebuke, and there's one idea that, like the Rebbe also talks about in Parshas Nayach, that when something is very practical, and it's like right now you have to say something, you have to be able to be direct and be assertive and just say it like it is. Sometimes you have to be able to do that. If something is not relevant in that kind of immediate way, then you should always, your priority should be to be polite and say it in a nice way, and kind of couch it in a more, in more subtle terms or things like that, so that it's not as harsh. And like again in Kodesh in Polychinuk Hadracha, and its booklet that the previous Rebbe wrote about education, he also talks about the idea that rebuke, one of the most important things, it has to be very polite, and that itself is a very important thing to teach. Like teach some people how to be able to be assertive while still being polite. In America, I feel like there's this idea that you don't have to be like overly polite, and that if you have to be angry to say something negative, and it's good to learn to be able to be direct and have those kind of uncomfortable conversations in a nice, polite way, going back to that other interpretation of if somebody's doing something that bothers you, to say something, hey, why'd you do that, and speak it out, being comfortable doing that. But then there's another idea that the Rebbe talks about that he recommends that all of us try to strive for, of the most beautiful, most positive way of rebuking somebody. And so in doing this, again, it's a whole sikha, but we're just going to take a couple of points from it. He takes a look in Rambam Mishnah Torah, in the laws of Hilchos Deis, where he's talking about character traits, how we should act. So in chapter 5, he talks about the way a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar, is supposed to act. In chapter 6, he talks about in general the laws for every person of how we're supposed to treat each other, love, with loving our fellows or stuff. So when he's speaking about the way a Talmid Chacham is supposed to act, he talks about how he's supposed to speak. In Law 7, right? He says that he shouldn't scream, he shouldn't shout like an animal. When he's speaking, he shouldn't do that. He shouldn't raise his voice unnecessarily. He should always speak very pleasantly to everyone, and he shouldn't seem aloof or be arrogant. He should, as if he should always be relatable to people, things like that. He should try to be the first to greet people, to be right, so they'll feel comfortable with him. And he says here that he should judge everyone favorably, and he should only speak their praise and never their criticism. And he should love peace, pursue peace, and things like that. And if he sees that his words are going to benefit other people, to listen to them, then he should speak. If he doesn't think they'll listen, he should remain silent. Which is, again, a very important point that it talks about always in the laws of criticism, that if you don't think people are going to listen, then don't say anything. The whole point is to help the person, not just generally. I mean, there's always different, caveats. Sometimes there's an idea that you need to lodge a protest just so it shows you don't agree with things, but that's a whole nother getting into all the nitty-gritty details. But the Rebbe asks, what is this idea that why does it say it this way? That you should say his praise and never his criticism. It seems, if you want to emphasize that you shouldn't say not nice things, in the next chapter, we're talking about the general laws of Ahavas Yisrael for every Jew. It's not just for a Torah scholar. It also says you're supposed to speak nicely about people. You're not supposed to go around criticizing them. And if the simple way that you might understand this is saying, well, because a Torah scholar has to be very concerned of causing a chilul Hashem, that he's going to turn people off, he's not nice. So therefore, he has to be very careful not to say things that are not going to be taken well. But then he should have put that first. It should have said first, he shouldn't speak their criticism and then say he should praise them, because the emphasis should have been on that. That's something you have to worry about first, and make sure don't say anything that's going to upset anybody, and then say nice things. So rather, the Rebbe says that this is one clause, and it's connected to this idea of judging everyone favorably. That's that even like the Rebbe is going to see, we'll see, even a situation where the person is doing something wrong, therefore you have to judge them favorably, it has to be done in this way that you're saying only the praise and not the criticism at all.
What's your Hebrew word for criticism?
So here, like genusai. That's in this code. speak their shavach, their praise, and not speak about their, it really would be
Degradation.
yeah, or pointing out their flaws or something. So the Rebbe says, what does this mean? So he says, in order to understand this, we need to have a deeper understanding of the idea of judging our fellow favorably. So he brings from Tanya, chapter 30 in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says that we have a mitzvah not to judge our fellow until we stand in his place, right? And the Alter Rebbe says, why? Because his place is what caused him to sin. His situation, his circumstances. He says, for example, because this person's working in the market and his eyes are always seeing things, whatever, so you can't. Maybe if you're in that situation, right, you would sin too. So you can't judge another person because unless you're in their shoes. And so here the Rebbe say, so in other words, we have this general idea of what when we say to judge somebody favorably, we think it means to like make an excuse for them. To say, well, and even reading this in Tanya, that's the way I would have understood it, right? Or until I read the Sikha, that's the way I understood it. He's saying that you can't really judge the person because maybe there's other circumstances that contributed to it. But you're really saying the person's doing something wrong, but I'm just finding excuses for it. That's the way people usually
Mitigating factors.
Right, mitigating factors. There we go. So, but the Rebbe says that's not really making it a schus. It says you should don the chasidus, you judge the person to the side of merit. It's not making it a merit, it's just taking away the guilt. So how are you actually making it a merit? And so the Rebbe says that when we realize that that he's not just in that situation, God put him in the situation where he gave him this livelihood. So Hashgacha Pratis is saying that you need it, or in all kinds of other circumstances, when a person is born into a certain family and they have a certain profession, all these kind of things that God arranges for the person. So it wasn't necessarily their choice to be like in that situation. And so the fact that God is putting them in that situation with these challenges shows that they have God also gives them the ability and knows that they have the ability to overcome it, or else they wouldn't be put there. And so this is this key idea the Rebbe says of judging somebody favorably in this deeper sense is recognizing that any time a person has a challenge, especially if it's a challenge that I don't have, that shows they also have a certain potential and a certain ability to transform that into something good that I don't have. And that God already now has given them that ability to overcome it, or else they wouldn't have the challenge. Like there's a saying that according to the camel's the load, God only gives a person something they can handle. So if he's giving them this challenge, also you're guaranteed that he also has the unique power to overcome it. And that may be something that even you don't have. And so here, this is a very characteristic thing of Chasidus, that we want to, again, not just relate to each other and be able to say, okay, I can also relate to challenges and things like that. I can see that I have that same flaw in myself in some way, even though in my case, it's obviously much more subtle and much more holy than that person's case, right? So all of those, the Rebbe says a deeper thing, you should actually see how the other person has an advantage that you don't have. That the very fact that they're struggling with this challenge, that means that they have opportunities and spiritual strengths that I don't have, they can accomplish something else. And again, like the Rebbe says that we see that Moshe actually learned at Mount Torah from simple people that were struggling. And that's finding a merit in them. And he says this is the idea of the way a Talmid Chacham should rebuke. So even though if a person does rebuke just based on the first two ways, and they're just saying it, what you're doing is wrong and whatever, that's okay, and there's a place for that. But there's this more beautiful way of rebuke that a Talmid Chacham is required to do, which is where you find the merit and it totally removes any sort of blame. And so this is the idea that you should say, see in the person that, look, you actually have an opportunity that I don't have, and I'm actually envious of you. And I actually, view you as having this situation is actually a merit. And so we see this again, going back to Hayin Yom. So in Elul, there's this idea, it says before giving rebuke, we have to cut our nails. Because the idea of a fingernail is like in Yiddish, it's like giving a shtach, giving a poke to somebody, and that idea of saying, hey, being a stickler and poking people and things like that, that's the idea of the fingernail, and that's the idea of klipa. And so it's interesting, the reason that this does relate to rebuke, that he says you have to have this idea of cutting your nails before rebuking somebody, that it's because any sort of slight to somebody is a negative thing. But I think that relates to, again, with this Hayom we had more recently, where that there's two things I don't see related otherwise. It starts off saying that there's a custom that the Rebbe Rashab, when he would burn his fingernails, he would put a piece of wood in it. So it talks about a custom relating to this idea of cutting the nails. And then it brings this story, which I think is an example of this approach of being rebuked that the Rebbe is advocating in this Sikha. So it says there was a simple chassid, Reb Elia, a beller, and he was a simple merchant, and he came to the Rebbe Marash once a Chasidus. And so he told him, Elia, I envy you. Right? So again, he was finding the fact that he was in this situation, he was finding it as actually saying, you have an opportunity I don't have. Even me as a Rebbe, right? I'm envious of you. And he means it, right? When the Rebbe, when a Rebbe says something, he's not just being cute, right? He's sincerely looking at that person and learning from them and finding something. He says, you travel to all the markets, you meet all these different types of people. And when you're in the middle of these business deals, you have these opportunities to tell something about Torah, say something from, Ein Yaakov, from whether inspire them to study some Nicholas and Chasidus. And when you do that, you create such a great joy in heaven that when you're in the middle of your business, you take these little opportunities to say a little thing, right? And he says, God pays up commission with blessings of children, health, wealth. And the bigger the market, the more the work and the more the livelihood. But you see this idea that he's encouraging him. He's not saying it's not just right that you should just spend all your time doing business and not think about, He's saying, look, you have an opportunity. And specifically because it's in a situation which is not so germane to studying Torah and all these kind of things, you could find a way to inject it in there. It's a tremendous thing that I can accomplish. I'm envious what you can accomplish there. And so this kind of most beautiful way of rebuking somebody where you actually see the merit in them. And the Rebbe says that the very interesting thing that the name of the parsha, Parshas Emor, you can read it as an instruction. Like in Hebrew, there's in some languages, this idea of like a tense in the word, which is like a command. So Emor means speak, like you're telling somebody that you have to do it. And he says that the parsha is teaching us that we have an obligation to find these type of positive merits in people, specifically related to like their struggles, and speak about it. Because by seeing that and telling the person about it or talking about it, it helps the person find that in themselves and actually actualize it, bring it out themselves. Like there's a famous teaching of Rabbi Binyamin Walters like that became a song that when you judge somebody favorably, then they actually helps them become do tshuva and come to the side of merit. And so this is the idea that when we look at people in this way and see that type of positivity and see that every situation a person was put in, even a challenging one that maybe right now they're failing in, is actually showing that they have a unique opportunity to accomplish something that's even a tzaddik couldn't accomplish. And this again, something that Chasidus always wants us to do is look at everything as not being just b'diavad. In other words, there's an idea in Torah that you have something that's like an unfortunate circumstance, right? Or you can view it as, no, this is something that God specifically wants it to be this way. He chose it to be this way. He created it, specifically created the world, created you, put you in the situation, and this is your mission in life. And this is a unique opportunity. When you see it that way, it empowers you to react to it in a much, much stronger way, as opposed to just looking at it as like, okay, there's a certain hierarchy, you're supposed to be doing this, and you're not, you got to climb the ladder, you're starting way behind, you're never going to get there, and say, that approach is not nearly as empowering as when you can say, no, in fact, wherever you are, and again, this is kind of related to the idea of like Seva this idea that, there's no real up and down in a circle. There's no real reference point. You're just out in space. There's no up and down, right? So from God's point of view, there is no essential hierarchy. You can say this person is higher and this person is lower. And so you can look, if you know how to look at each person's situation, you can say this person actually is, has the greatest opportunity more than anybody else in the entire world. And seeing that and speaking about it empowers a person in the strongest, most beautiful way. So that's what the Rebbe encourages us to do. There's actually a beautiful story kind of from our hometown. What's it?
Is there significance that we know about the wood with the nails, or it's just cutting the nails in that story?
Why?
Actual nails.
You're saying why that custom is to put the wood in there?
Yeah.
Or how that's related to the story?
Either way.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just making that connection now of myself. I've never seen that connection. The simple reason we put the wood is right, so that you need not to hurt yourself from burning your nails. But I suspect that it's related somehow to this idea of, the idea of cutting the nails, I think, is related to not shtaching. And I think the idea of putting the wood in there is maybe related to it also. This idea of
I think it just makes it burn faster. There's like that pain level in the person's fingernails are being burnt, and now it's even like burning faster. So he's willing to tolerate that, and that's part of the whole work. It's uncomfortable for a person to see his body part being burned up, and even so, he adds in wood. I mean, and have lighter fluid, and they burn the body. That's what they have.
right, or maybe related to this, it's also that if you're like injecting some positive purpose in there, so then it makes it not a damaging thing. But I don't know, that's so sorry for you. Anyway, so there's this great story that happened with Rabbi Slavatisky's father. I'm assuming you guys probably know Rabbi Slavatisky somewhat. Yeah. Right. So you can, but this was printed in a chura, so I know a lot of times stories grow heads and tails. So I know this was like the way the story happened. But basically, there was and this is an example where the Rebbe really exemplified this idea that there was a young man that was coming around the battles there. Every now and then he would disappear for a couple of weeks or whatever, a couple months, and come back. And but he started putting on tefillin, keeping kosher, and all this kind of stuff. And so he asked him what's going on. So finally, he divulged that he has a girlfriend in Italy that they've been seeing each other for a long time, and they kind of were supposed to be married, but now he's getting more religious. She's not Jewish. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't feel like he can break it off, but he feels like he's getting more religious, so he doesn't know what to do. And he was so he said, let's go to the Rebbe for dollars. And it's so he went with him to the Rebbe, and he's expecting, I suspect, I'm not sure, I think it was maybe a little Sephardi background. He's expecting to get a real kind of fire and brimstone kind of thing about what all the types of hell that he could come from intermarriage and all this kind of stuff. But actually, when he came to the Rebbe, let's see, we can buy dollars, right? So this is what he said, right? So at first, all I saw was his holy eyes that penetrate deep, deep within me. Although I had rehearsed my words 100 times, my mind went blank. Standing before the Rebbe, my mind stopped functioning. So I guess it was functioning. I felt as if my innermost being was visible to him. I could not get out a single word. The Rebbe gave me $1. I stretched out my hand to take it. The Rebbe did not let go. Right, the Rebbe was holding there. And he's, so there I stood, me holding the dollar from one end, the Rebbe holding it from the other. The Rebbe gazed at me the entire time lovingly. I felt as if the Rebbe opened me up. I calmed down. Finally, I eked out the words, I have a problem. The Rebbe leaned over, right, I guess I could hear. And he said, I began coming close to Judaism, but I have a non-Jewish girlfriend whom I decided to marry. Right, and then he choked up and he couldn't say anything. And so again, thought the Rebbe was going to tell him about this and that. And the Rebbe said, I envy you. And so he said, I don't remember the exact words, but the basic idea the Rebbe told him was this. That's what the person said, that in life there are many ladders. And the ladders are our choices. And God gives each of us the power of choice. And this is a ladder that reaches the highest heights. Right, through choices, we can go higher and higher. So this test is your challenge, and it will raise you to the highest level. The Rebbe said, never had this test. And God gave you this challenge because he believes in you, and he gave you the strength to stand strong and to succeed. Right, so the Rebbe finished, and he said, then he didn't know he was like in a daze. He ended up in 770, and in a corner crying and everything like that. But it gave him the, strength to overcome his challenge.
That was easy though. The guy had already basically surrendered. He was there in 770.
Okay. He was looking for it. He was looking for help. But I just think that this story is exact example of what the Rebbe talks about in the Sefer, what a person should do. That so yeah. I mean, listen, the Rebbe, you see, when people come to the Rebbe wouldn't always just tell them offer everything they were doing. That wasn't, the Rebbe would find something that they would be willing to do and encourage them in that area, right? And I mean, that's a very important thing also. Or there's like a famous story that the previous Rebbe, when some people came to him and they were offended that this rabbi's coming from Europe, he's going to come tell us how to live in America. And the Frierdiker Rebbe called them in for ahead of the line, right? And he shook their hands. They were treated them respect. They were very impressed by that. And he said, "What do you want from us?" And the Rebbe said, "Listen, there's 613 mitzvahs. I can't do all of them, right? But I do what I can. So all I ask from you, I know you can't do everything. I ask you, do what you can." Right? So, and I think these stories really exemplify that idea of again these attitudes of not holding oneself above somebody else. He's saying, "Listen, we're the same boat. We can't do everything. We try to do our best." And presenting that in this way of actually not of seeing that the same finding the same issue in ourselves and feeling that we're working along with the other person, and even more so being able to, like it says when Mashiach comes, that every tzaddik will be envious of his fellow, like it says in the Haggadah about the idea of what Mara represents, the bitter herb represents. That when Mashiach comes, we're going to have this jealousy of each other because everyone's going to be envious of what the other person can accomplish. So looking at be able to find that in other people, at least striving towards it. Obviously, we're not always going to be there, but if we're not there, that means we should keep our mouth shut. Also, at least at that time.
What about this all sounds good. What about the when it says, stir up your anger against your Yetzer Sahara?
Right.
So
Your Yetzer Hara, not the other.
it's the same thing, internal, external. It's all Yetzer Sahara. It's all klipa. It's all anti-Torah. So, and yeah, it's easier to get angry at somebody else than yourself. But there's a place for anger.
Yeah, there is, and that's the thing. Like the Rebbe says, that the Talmud Chacham has a special obligation to always do it in this most beautiful way. But there's a place for just being direct and doing somebody's doing that. And even the Rebbe, you see, sometimes it's more direct and more fiery than other times. But again, the main thing is that, and this is just the key in everything in Torah mitzvahs, is to remember that people come first. The whole purpose of Torah mitzvahs is because people have essential value, and we see that as a job. We're trying to cultivate it and grow it and things like that. So then, like the Rebbe says, about the rebukes in the Torah, right? So when there's a story about the Alter Rebbe used to always lane, used to always be the Baal Kaira, and once he was away, and his son the Mitzvah heard all the curses and the Taifacha from a different person, and he was so affected by it, so disturbed by it, that this happened on Tisha B'Av. There was a question whether he could fast on Yom Kippur a few weeks later.
It's just somebody before Rosh
Hashanah. Sorry, before Rosh Hashanah. And so they asked him, right, don't you hear this every year? So the normal way they say the story is that when my father reads, you don't hear curses. But the Rebbe said a different version and explained it once in a Farbrengen, that when a father reads, then you don't hear curses. Because if you view it from the perspective of a father obviously loves his child, always because of the child. So even if he's rebuking him, it's only with that attitude of I love you and I want to help you. So there has to definitely be first that I think of just very practically, if you've never said hello to somebody before and you don't have a connection with them and you don't love them or know them or care about them, and they don't know that care about them, so then it's probably if you already built a relationship and you have a connection, that's definitely Yisrael.
I don't know if this is my place to say, but it sounds like this is the Chabad versus Chagas. So then you talk about Ditchev, who's always, it sounds like cute. Oh, like he always comes up with some cute way of saying, even in the middle of davening, he's even in the middle of fixing his wagon, he's davening. And like Chasidus is teaching us to actually perceive the virtue that person has, which for some reason is manifesting this less than favorable behavior.
Find it by Yisrael. When Yisrael gives the suggestion to Moshe, he's always referred to as Moshe's father. We know why, because Moshe Rabbeinu, I spoke to God, I spoke to Parah. You think you know better? Well, if you know that it comes from love, then you're more tolerant, more willing to accept it. A total stranger may give you maybe great advice, but not as accepting of the total stranger's advice, even if it's correct, because there's a suspicion.
So I have a comment and a question. You use the word practical. So I work for a big corporation, and I recently was directed by my HR representative to rebuke some. So the comment is, so I work with the HR representative to put together the strategy and the words on what to say to the person. So I found it very effective to work with another person to actually say the right thing. So I don't know if the Rebbe talks about, I mean, obviously you couldn't be specific so that other person knows who you're talking to, but it seems like it's very practical advice, especially if it's something very critical to talk to someone else about what to say to a person, right? So two heads are better than one, or maybe even more than two.
Right.
So that's a comment. The question is, so I have to give a rebuke to this person. Okay, it's a corporate environment. It's a non-Jewish person. So and everybody knows I'm Jewish. So I get the feeling often that people aren't looking at what Steve does, but what a Jew does. You get looked at, not, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So, okay, so the question is, when you're in an environment where you're either where it's an HR situation, not specifically spiritual, another cause of whatever, it can be a Jew or non-Jew, okay? But you are a Jew, you have to rebuke someone. Do you have any guidance outside of the specific sphere when you have to rebuke someone who's not a Jew, and under a legal framework?
Yeah, I mean, I think with being, just really practical tools, which it doesn't necessarily get into all the nitty gritties of that so much. I find in Chasidus, you'll have an idea that's just, mentioned in a few places in brief, and then you'll have in the world, you have maybe, tens of books written about it, right, that idea. But the tools that I learned that are very helpful, probably the biggest thing is there's a few aspects of what's going on whenever a person is doing something, and usually they get all entangled, and they really need to be separated out before you can be really effective in review. And so one thing is just saying the objective thing that is happening. This is what we're seeing. Okay, we're seeing that you're coming later. We're seeing that you're working, and whatever it is. Then, so you lay that out there, and again, just not without attaching any emotionalism or judgment. This is just the facts of what we're seeing, or what I've been told, or whatever is going on. Then listen to what they have to say about it, which is again this idea of that you should tell the person, this is what I'm seeing. Tell me your story. And once you listen to what they have to say, make sure you understand there's always a valid need and valid concern that a person is trying to accomplish, or or struggling with, which is causing them to behave a certain way. And being able to understand that and relate that yourself, I understand you struggle with this, I struggle with that, and validate that, okay, I get that, that's totally valid. I do that myself. But then what you want to do is help the person separate that valid need from the inappropriate behavior, and say, okay, even though that's true, that doesn't, we still have to find a way to stop this. It still is not okay. And then as soon as you made that separation, and if you need to, you could even, if you have to attach, and if we don't deal with it, there are going to be these consequences attached to that, then you can switch back to being their coach and being on their side. I mean, what can I do to help support you? How can we solve this? And you can be collaborative again of what could help do it. And I've always found having those kind of conversations, I mean, in my experience mostly with high school kids doing that kind of thing, but they always come out feeling good, and feel like you're on their side, you care about them, even though it's a difficult conversation. If you don't do all those steps, then they feel like they're not heard, they're not understood, and they're just being attacked, and people are defensive. But so it's a combination of being frank about what you're seeing, and then being able to separate out, like, yeah, that's totally valid, and validate their emotions, their needs, and then call out faulty thinking, call out, the problem, and then help, you can help problem solve it with, we can go back to being on their side. So.
Very good. That's the general framework of how to play out.
Yeah, how does it? Yeah, like just with crafting. I mean, I help people craft scripts like that for like high school students stuff, but it's similar idea for adults. Just has to be done a little differently because of the power dynamic is different.
It's very interesting how sometimes people do things they have no idea that they're doing anything that would negatively affect another person.
Right.
Sometimes they have.
Right. A lot of times they're still stuck.
In a situation where they're angry or upset and said something.
Right. Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think very often people have something that they know. Like usually people know their own flaws more than other people, and it bothers them, but they don't know what to do about it. So they try to ignore it, or they try to cover it up, or they.
Actually, that's what this person has sexist views. Okay, so he has a certain thought process about women's role in the world, and it came out in some comments he made to a woman at work. Okay, so nothing's going to change him. It's just that a matter of recognizing how his words affect other people and how this kind of discussion is appropriate for that setting. So the idea was to change his behavior because we knew we were going to change the person.
Right. Thank you. Absolutely.
Is the rebuking, is it always on a specific topic, or can you rebuke a person